CIUT 89.5 FM, the sound of your city. Celebrating 30 years on the FM dial. Stream CIUT or listen to recent shows at www.ciut.fm.
And welcome. You are listening live to Three Women here on CIUT 89.5 FM. I'm your host, Cheri Dinovo, MPP Parkdale High Park. And it is, you may not know this, but it is June, and June is Brain Injury Awareness Month. We have an incredible team of women. We actually have 4 women in the studio today to talk about brain injury, what it is, how prevalent it is, who it affects, how it affects them. And certainly we're always interested in your take too. You can phone in, which that's if you're, one of those extroverted folk, at 416-946-7000, or you can tweet at me at CHERIDINOVO. Always interested in your comments as well. But let me introduce our panel. First of all, we've got Dr. Angela Colantonio. She's the Director of Rehab Sciences Institute at the University of Toronto. She's also the Canadian Institute for Health Research Chair in Gender, Work and Health, with a focus on brain injury, and the author of over 250 publications. Welcome, Dr. Angela, to Three Women.
It's a pleasure to be here.
And we also have Celia Missios. Celia was a marketing and business developer for a communications company until a tragic car accident in 2006. She's going to tell us about that. Welcome.
Thank you.
And we have Melissa Vigar, who's the Executive Director of the Brain Injury Society of Toronto. Welcome.
Thank you for having us.
And finally, Colleen Worsley. Colleen, welcome. Colleen's actually doing an internship in my office at the moment, but when she's not doing that, she's a board member as well of the Brain Injury Society of Toronto and has had 20 years experience in rehabilitative healthcare. So welcome all to Three Women. Dr. Angela, let's start with you. So tell us, first of all, what are we talking about when we're talking about brain injury? For most people out there listening who haven't experienced it in their direct family or haven't experienced them themselves, they're not quite clear on what we mean when we speak about that.
So brain injury is defined as an alteration in brain function due to an external force. So you don't necessarily even have to lose consciousness to have a brain injury like a concussion. And the kinds of symptoms you would have after brain injury would range dramatically in terms of where you are in the brain affected, what kind of history you have if you had prior brain injuries, also any other existing health conditions. And also we're seeing some differences by gender, sex gender. But you can have, it can affect cognition, such as the way you think, your memory, concentration. It can affect your mood in terms of how you feel, like depression is not uncommon. Also, people may have what's called disinhibition in terms of may have less control over their emotions. And it also affects, it can affect sleep, communication, vision, depending your sensory input. And also community integration, like return to work, and of course can have a great impact on your family.
Can you have a brain injury and not know it?
Actually, we have had interviewed people who on the books, they lost consciousness, and they've said, I didn't know I had a brain injury, I just lost consciousness. So we've interviewed people like that.
And often I would imagine, well, maybe often, I don't know, you're the expert, people who've, been hit in the head or had an accident may lose consciousness and things shift in their lives, and they might not necessarily think it's associated with that accident, right?
Exactly. We see that actually we're like in some of the issues around disinhibition and so forth in terms of certain behaviors, people are just labeled as, without knowing about the prior brain injury, might be at risk for even incarceration for some of the behaviors, and also some of the treatment resistance around substance and alcohol abuse, for instance. might be due to the fact that people haven't recognized a prior brain injury.
Melissa, how prevalent is it in the population? And particularly, for example, you just heard the doctors talking about incarcerated folk, and also people who are in shelters. How frequent is this?
Well, we were just talking about this. I know Dr. Colantonio has done some research on it, but about 53%, I think I have that right, of the homeless population have had a prior brain injury, or 70% of that number had a brain injury prior to becoming homeless. So, I mean, that's really demonstrates how much a brain injury can impact your life. You can lose track of your finances, you can lose track of social relationships, you certainly can become unemployed, and this kind of goes into a downward spiral. So it is quite prevalent.
So if you're a shelter worker, or you're a corrections officer, you may be seeing people with brain injuries and not know it, and in fact they may not know it. Is that correct?
Absolutely, yeah. And Colleen and I actually just did a presentation with Homes First to talk about that very thing, that people who are in the shelter situation are probably running into issues you would find common amongst people with brain injury, but not really knowing it. And sometimes people can get labeled as being lazy, or just not following through on tasks, or argumentative, forgetful, or not trying hard enough. And really those are all things you would see with someone with a brain injury. But if they're coming there from the street, they don't have the medical documentation that shows it, and people are just dealing with the behaviors, not really knowing what's going on in the inside.
So, doctor, how do you diagnose a brain injury then? What happens if somebody walks into their GP and says, I'm forgetting things, my mood swings, or discusses symptoms? I mean, I can see most GPs would not say first brain injury. They might say many other things.
Well, first of all, I want to clarify, I'm not a medical doctor.
Okay.
I'm a researcher.
Okay.
So I'm not here to give medical advice.
Of course. Mm-hmm.
But, typically the diagnosis is taking a history, the symptoms, if they lost consciousness, a history about the event. Then there's neuropsychological testing as well. People often to reach diagnosis.
So they would go through that. But I could imagine often with somebody walking into a GP would get misdiagnosed if people don't link it. I mean, often people have an accident, forget about it, and go on with their lives and experience symptoms that they don't necessarily relate back to that incident.
We have a lot of individuals who have had a car accident or a bad fall, and there can be internal injuries that are life-threatening, and so that's the original focus. They're not focusing on the assault to the brain at that time, too. So those individuals can get overlooked, and it's like 6 months later, 8 months later, there's, this lingering brain fog, is which some people will describe it as, and there's an inability to return to their former life at full capacity.
So, Celia, let's talk to somebody who has actually been through this. You've been through this. Take us through it from the beginning, from what happened to you, and then.
I was a pedestrian struck by a car in 2006, and it was at Laird and Eglinton area there. And I was in a coma for about 7 weeks. After that, I was at Sunnybrook. I was a trauma patient there. When I was well enough to be transferred to St. John's Rehab, because I had a lot of broken bones and a lot of internal injury, so I had to heal from that. And I basically had to relearn how to think, how to breathe on my own, because my lungs had collapsed. I had to learn how to walk. I had to learn how to talk, to feed myself, to go to the bathroom by myself. So it was just
and
basically...
how long was that? How long did that
The
whole
process, I went home probably early February, end of January.
So sorry, how long was that from the accident until you got home?
About 4 months, I think.
It's
about 4 months. And I went home with 24-hour care. So I had someone in my home helping me to bathe, to go to the bathroom. And you become very humble because you're totally dependent. Think of a toddler that's dependent on a stranger to take care of your most personal needs at that time. I don't think I really realized the impact of the accident until probably year 2. The first year, I thought I was going to go back to work in the springtime.
Presumably there were outward physical issues as well.
There was. I had, I was struck on the right side by the driver's mirror. It wasn't even full on with the car. And I had a totally destroyed right elbow, my right arm. They basically wanted to amputate the arm at one point. And my sister and brother, thankfully, I owe my arm to them. They said if it's not life-threatening, they weren't going to authorize that. There was just so much damage. And because of my lungs collapsing and I was bleeding out, they stopped counting somewhere around 54 units of blood. And so my diaphragm had ruptured, my liver had been lacerated, and it came up into, I guess, the lung area, which compressed on that. And
So you almost died. You could have died.
they said, I've heard some of the staff at Sunnybrook say that I flatlined at one point on the OR. I had a crushed right pelvic, and they were supposed to put plates in there, and I guess I went into some arrest or something, and they had to pull me out. Luckily, because it did heal on its own, and I don't have plates on there, my walking isn't as affected. My brother-in-law said, he's a doctor, and he had said to my sister, she'll never wear jeans again. And, I'm in the coma at this time, so my sister was dealing with this, and she was pretty devastated at that thought. But because they didn't put a plate in, I didn't lose. It's tilted a little bit forward, but nothing as what it would have been.
If you've just tuned in, you're listening to Three Women. We actually have 4 women in the studio today. We're very live. What you've just been listening to is Celia Missios, who's talking about a car accident. She was a pedestrian, got hit by a car, and the focus of the show really is on Brain Injury Awareness Month and on brain injuries and how often we overlook them. We don't know how prevalent it is. So when do you first remember what was happening to you after the accident? When did that start?
Like in terms of I have no memory of the accident whatsoever, and I didn't really remember up to probably about 7 hours prior to the accident. I had lost that. Friends have filled in, what I did that day and things like that. I think it was at the end of year 1 that I started thinking, okay, I wanted to be back to work in spring, and now we're back to October again, and I'm still not back to work. Something's not right. And of course, I had a wonderful care team around me. They knew what was wrong, and the fact that, I had a brain injury. I wasn't really in tune to that. And it became like earlier you were talking about how the behaviors, and I had no filter. So if something upset me and I didn't know how to deal with it, I would get very angry, and I would yell and I would scream. And at the same time that that's happening, excuse me, I'm aware of it, but you can't stop it. Like, you just go on this verbal diarrhea, per se, of whatever is in your head is what comes out. So my team knew what was happening. I didn't. And people around me, they started to understand that there was something wasn't right. Like, I was healing physically, but something was still not working properly.
So when did you first hear the term brain injury? When did you hear that from someone in describing you?
I think that probably would have been about year 2, a little over the 2-year mark, when I had a rehab therapist come in, and I would complain, like, why can't I do this? And, I know how to do this, and why can't I remember to brush my teeth? Because I couldn't understand. I would make a list of things that I needed to do in the morning, like just normal personal grooming things that I'd been doing all my life. Yet in the morning, if I got distracted, I'd go without washing my face, I'd go without brushing my teeth, I'd go without showering. And, I would put clothes on that weren't necessarily appropriate for the weather. So it's like summer and I'm putting a sweatshirt on. It's winter and I'm putting shorts on. So it was like really relearning what was appropriate, what wasn't.
And so what did rehab look like for your brain injury? Now, you've already at this point gone through all sorts of rehab for your physical, outwardly apparent injuries. Brain injuries also physical. But what did that rehab look like?
Well, I had a behavioral therapist. I had cognitive therapy. I also had a worker that came in and helped me to deal with situations of going back into the community. And I think, if I hadn't had that support and that help, I wouldn't be where I am today. I'm a very lucky girl to be where I am and to have recovered. I don't think you ever 100% recover from brain injury because I still feel a lot of the fatigue. Like if I'm doing something like today, I have to make sure that I'm not really overexerting myself prior to arriving and that afterwards I have time to go home and rest. So it's just really learning the different things that affect you and the triggers. There's a lot of planning that goes into this, into living a life. And I know that I am a very lucky person, and that's why I've chosen to do what I do and to help to bring awareness, because not everybody is as lucky as I am. I'm I think a minute percentage of people, and there's a lot of people that can't speak for themselves.
Colleen, I'm going to go to you. What does that behavioral therapy look like? What do you do to help folk?
Well, it's figuring out what their challenges are. What are their triggers? Because each individual have a very individual presentation. There are some things that do look the same. The lack of insight and impulsivity, and they'll have different levels of fatigue to manage. So it is teaching that person who doesn't have insight quite often, getting them into a daily routine that they can manage. So breaking things down for them, to take on if they wanted to read even instructions on a page to put together an IKEA bookshelf, that's probably a bad example. Because
I can't do that.
You have to, it's about setting aside a lot of time for that, breaking down those instructions. Let's just do 3 of them. Let's do 3, the top 3 today, and set it aside and not come back to it for 2 days. Like, it's teaching them how, as Celia said, there's a lot of planning that goes into a life, so a lot of teaching them how to do those strategies. I'm going to get in a car and there's going to be, or I'm going to go to a party, there's going to be a lot of noise. Can I manage that? Am I going to set a timer for myself? I'm going to leave when I feel like 10 minutes in. I'm going to go and sit quietly. I'm going to register how I'm feeling. It's all those small pieces into building a day.
So, Celia, in terms of your timelines we're now talking 11 years later.
Yes.
Are you back at work?
No, I haven't been able to return to the corporate world because every day is unpredictable. So I try to, plan as best as I can. But there might be, like today coming here, maybe 5 years ago, I probably would have canceled because I had a lot of turmoil that happened this morning with an air conditioner. So, but I've learned to manage that, and I've learned, as Colleen was saying, those are the tools that the therapists have left me with going forward. So it's the one thing I want to say to anyone who's listening who's going through a brain injury and they're in the early stages, there is life after brain injury. Never forget that. It's going to be different, and everybody goes through different stages.
And by the way, if you're just tuning in or you're out there in Radio Land, this is Brain Injury Awareness Month. That's why we're talking about it. And just heard from Celia, of course, talking about her own journey. I want to get back to you, Doctor, though, and talk about the difference. Clearly, this is a feminist radio show. The difference between a woman with a brain injury and a man with a brain injury. Is there a difference? What is it?
Well, we talk about also sex differences as well as gender differences. So sex referring to more the biological aspect. Of course, we have different hormones, different musculature, and also pain receptors. Gender speaks to more the social construct of our society in terms of how, for instance, women are exposed to different unequal opportunities, and that also affects our health. So sex differences, our lab was one of the first to study, for instance, menstrual cycle disruption after a brain injury, which because a lot of the injuries or the population is male-dominated, it hadn't been really looked at taking a sex-specific approach. And we found that, over half had menstrual cycle disruption after a brain injury. We didn't find, however, that conception was necessarily affected, but people had fewer live births. People were less likely to undergo pap smear afterwards, and also long-term feelings of depression, mental health, and often lack of services really to deal with some of these long-term consequences.
And is Celia's story a typical one? Is it an 11-year cycle that we're dealing with here?
Well, again, it really depends on who the person is. I think she's very fortunate to have had a career, and I know that people sometimes who, depending on the kind of injury, if they're in a motor vehicle crash, they might have supplemental insurance. They have supportive families. It makes a huge difference.
And talking about insurance, and I guess we have to at some point, and Melissa, maybe you want to jump in here, but my understanding is we have some of the highest rates for insurance in Ontario, and we have some of the lowest payouts in terms of catastrophic injury. What do you find with clients who've had brain injuries?
It is part of the reason, well, not part of the reason, but BIST certainly exists to service a lot of folks who don't have the benefits. And you're absolutely right. The legislation was actually recently changed, and your benefits have been cut even further. So there is a lack of access to a lot of resources, and if you don't have that extra insurance, you're not as fortunate to get your own occupational therapist or a rehab support worker or a behavioral therapist. So people can really struggle. And one of the things BIST serves to do is to try and close...
And BIST, please.
Sorry, BIST is the Brain Injury Society of Toronto.
Right.
It's so much to say, we just go with BIST. But yeah, so we offer programming, weekly programs, and once a month we have someone like a behavioral therapist come in and provide tricks and tips that people can use to kind of help themselves deal with life after a brain injury. Last month and this month we have somebody talking about how to use your phone better. So what you can be doing on your phone to help you remember things, to set timers, things like that. Because again, if you don't have the insurance, you're really trying to figure these things out on your own, and we're here to kind of help that piece.
And how are you funded?
We are completely funded by fundraising. So we have three fundraising events a year, and also we have corporate sponsors. So we have annual corporate sponsors who help us keep afloat, which we're very grateful for.
So
very
important
grateful.
that you're there. And I want to get back to this instance in shelters and in correctional institutions, because I I always think the government's a little, sometimes penny wise, pound foolish, in saving some money here, for example, on really in the insurance side of things, but you'll pay it out in corrections. So it costs a fortune to keep somebody in a correctional institution. It costs a lot of money to keep somebody in a shelter, quite frankly. It's right up there with a hotel bill in most shelters. And yet we're somehow willing to do that and not pay to help people get better.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And it's not just, it's certainly very important. We have the shelters and we have the criminal justice system where there's a high incidence of people with brain injuries. But there's also a lack of funding for residential spots for people with brain injuries. So we have a lot of young people who have an acquired brain injury who might be living in a long-term care facility. Right. And again, in those facilities, they're not getting the support they need because the staff there, who are amazing at what they do, are not trained to service people who are younger with a brain injury and trying to teach them, again, the strategies that they could use to help them move forward with their lives.
So the ideal scenario, what would that look like for someone who's had a brain, someone like Celia? What would the ideal, it sounds like your experience was pretty much ideal.
It was good because the fact that I was diagnosed catastrophic on the onset, so by the time I came out of the coma, I think they had already concluded that. And a lawyer was also brought in early on because the doctors at Sunnybrook had basically told my family to plan my funeral. And so my family was they're from Windsor area, so they were trying to figure out, do they bury me in Toronto? Did they bury me in Windsor? And it was at that grave state. And my brother's now wife, at the time she was a lawyer, she didn't do personal injury, but the law firm she was with in Windsor, she said to him, you know, she's not going to make it. You need to get a lawyer involved at this point. And that's when the lawyer got involved, and a case manager from London was brought in. And they kept saying, you know, she's not going to make it all the way through. Like, I caught pneumonia, then I went septic on them, and
You are a miracle.
it was. That's what they say at Sunnybrook. So I'm starting to believe it. But yes, so it was like I would survive something, and then something else would happen. I would survive something, and then something else would happen. So it really affected my family. It affected my brother in particular. I had a friend say, you know, they were trying to celebrate when I'd, you know, overcome something. And his remarks started being, yes, but this can happen. So he was just very terrified that I wasn't going to make it. And, you know, I'm very lucky that I made it. And to the point about coverage, because I was catastrophic, I felt at that time, there was a different cap on help that you could get. And I remember being in waiting rooms and other people there in similar situations who hadn't been diagnosed catastrophic and needed as much help in rebuilding their lives as I did, even on a physical physiotherapy perspective. And they were having to deal, I think at that time, it was like $100,000 was their cap. And yet they had surpassed that. They still needed a lot of therapy, and there was no funding for it. So it's very devastating. There's also, like, we're speaking of how I got my injury, but things like stroke can also, an illness can also contribute to a brain injury, and none of that is covered. If somebody gets a stroke and needs the exact same help that I needed, they are not covered.
Yeah, it's shocking, truly. And again, it's not like folk are not going to cost the system somehow. It's just whether we pay for it in a dignified manner that helps people, or whether we punish people with the same amount of money. We're going to have to take a little bit of a break. We're going to play a tune, here's some station ID, pay some bills, and come right back. Stay tuned. This is Three Women on CIUT 89.5 FM.
Right here, right now, every day. CIUT 89.5 Toronto. Sound of your city.
Calling it quits. You think this is
And we are back. That was, by the way, Kathleen Edwards, Soft Place to Land, which is really what we're talking about here in terms of brain injury. It's Students' Brain Injury Awareness Month. We have an expert panel in the studio, and let me just go over who they are again. If you're just tuning in, we've got Dr. Angela Colantonio, Director of Rehab Sciences Institute at University of Toronto, also the Canadian Institute for Health Research Chair in Gender, Work and Health, with a focus on brain injury, and the author of over 250 publications. We've got Celia Missios, and if you tuned in a little earlier, you heard her story about living with a brain injury. We're going to come back to her, of course. And Melissa Vigar, Executive Director of Brain Injury Society of Toronto, or BIST. And Colleen Worsley, who's a board member of the same, of BIST, and with 20 years experience in rehabilitation for folk with brain injuries. Colleen, you had mentioned something about that person that maybe we might see on on one of our street corners in Toronto, raving. People do a wide berth around them, and often we associate, this is drugs or this is something else, but very often it is a brain injury in your experience.
Or it's the brain injury that led to them being living on that street or being centered out always, those, maybe that kid in the classroom that's constantly speaking out and acting out, the individual in the grocery store that you see yelling at the woman trying to work the cash simply because he's at a level of frustration that he can no longer control, and the filter is gone. Things are coming out of his mouth that he does not want to be saying, or her mouth that she does not want to be saying, but it's off and running, and often there can be police involvement because they are scaring people, but they're really just someone who it's an invisible injury. They look fine to looking to them, speaking to them initially. There doesn't seem to be anything wrong, but there really is.
There's been a lot of focus on police activity with those who suffer from mental health issues. Has there been some work done with the police force around brain injuries?
Oh, that's interesting. This is a good time to speak with Melissa again, because there's just recently, Melissa, please take it over.
Yeah, so actually BIST was invited to sit on the Disabilities Consultative Committee with the Toronto Police Force. And so what that is, it's a group of I think we're at 8 different organizations right now. We meet monthly with the Toronto Police to talk about issues regarding what somebody with a brain injury might present like, what somebody with autism might present like, and looking at what they do in situations. And we have a dialogue going about what we can do to better prepare people and what they can do when encountering somebody with a mental health issue or with a brain injury. So it's a relatively new group, but it's certainly one that is very beneficial to all parties.
Yeah, because police, of course, have to make decisions pretty quickly in situations, but still, if anything that, protects folk is a good thing, and education always does. So, Colleen, to get back to one of the things we were talking about at break was Rowan's Law, something that came through Queen's Park, actually. Talk about that. What was that about?
So while there's more and more education coming forth around people in injury, certainly Sidney Crosby's played a huge role in that, and different famous athletes. There was one young lady, there's a law now, Rowan's Law, and she was experienced, I think, 3 brain injuries back to back, and it resulted in her death at the end. And it's something that, people wonder, could it have been avoided if we had known how to, to slow it down, to ask the right questions, to listen to her words? Or was she hiding it because it demonstrated weakness? Was she not talking about it enough? There's so many questions surrounding the issue that need to be asked, and that we're starting to ask now. And recognizing that there might be, significant differences for women versus men when they've had a brain injury, and so different questions need to be asked of women, perhaps. So that's all. It's all new. It's all new information that we're learning all the time about the differences in brain injuries in general.
There's been huge press, of course, around concussions in professional sports and, in football in particular in the States. Has that helped your work, Melissa? Has that, Celia, you were saying that concussion is the designer word for brain injury.
Exactly. I'd love to hear When anyone is reporting on any athlete, please stop using the word concussion. It really minimizes, and it's a brain injury, and there's, like anything in life, there's varying degrees. So you might have a 1 brain injury, or you might have a 10 brain injury, or be somewhere in between the scale. But it's a brain injury. And the more people start using the word brain injury, the more people will seek out help. Much like mental illness, there is that stigma attached, and no one wanted to admit that there was something not quite right. It doesn't mean that there's something wrong. A brain injury doesn't necessarily mean that you've lost your intellectual ability. It just means that the way you present what you're trying to speak. For myself in the beginning, I knew what I wanted to say. The words were not coming out. And I want people to know that by saying you have a brain injury doesn't mean that you are not intelligent. It doesn't mean that you can't function. It just means that your brain is rewiring itself to function in a different manner. And I'm proof of that. When I started working with a speech therapist, my voice literally sounded like Minnie Mouse. And I had to relearn how to speak and how to, articulate my words. No one thought that I would ever be able to speak the way I speak today. I didn't certainly think I would. And I get people saying, you speak quite well. I would have never thought. It's taken a lot of hard work to get here, to try and remember words, and do, sort of like, if I hear somebody's name and it's got like wood or something related to a tree, and that all that things. So there are ways to function, just like people function with visible disabilities and other invisible disabilities. Brain injury, you can function. Now, again, it's different degrees. You're going to be either on the 1 scale or the 10 scale or somewhere in between. But don't set your limitations by other people's limitations for yourself.
Now, Melissa, obviously some of the work of BIST, the Brain Injury Society of Toronto, is educational. How do you go about that? How do you get the word out? For example, we heard the case of Rowan here, the inspired Rowan's Law. People just don't know.
People just don't know. So really, June being Brain Injury Awareness Month is when we come out and we do a lot of speaking about brain injury. So as I mentioned, Colleen and I were at Homes First. We do a big social media campaign. So if anyone goes to the website areyouaware.ca, they have specs and supports and resources about brain injury. We go into the hospitals in Toronto and hand out literature on brain injury and about resources in the city. Speaking of concussions, there's a lot more awareness in the sports world regarding concussions, but one of the things the Ontario Brain Injury Association has done to raise awareness is actually to go into women's shelters, because a lot of times there's certain populations that do tend to get missed, and someone who's going through a lot of physical trauma can have a brain injury, and that certainly can be diagnosed again because they're focusing on rebuilding their lives and other pieces, and that piece might get missed. So those are some of the awareness initiatives that both the Brain Injury Society of Toronto does, as well as the Ontario Brain Injury Association.
Now, in Rowan's Law and, of course, in professional sports, there have been a lot of lawsuits, too. And you heard in Celia's case, she was advised to get a lawyer, a personal injury lawyer. Is that something that happens for a lot of folk? Do they need that? Is it advisable to get a lawyer?
It certainly is advisable if it's been a slip and fall or a motor vehicle accident. Any way that you can go about to get more services for yourself, you're going to do better, obviously, right? And unfortunately, OHIP and the Ministry of Health don't have the resources or don't allocate the resources that people need to get better. Someone like Celia, who had a very traumatic brain injury, required that 24-hour support, required years of therapy. And that's just something that you can't really access through the Ministry of Health. So if you get a lawyer, it helps because once you have the brain injury, again, calling the insurance company, trying to figure out the paperwork, I mean, that's a lot to take on at a time of crisis, and it's a lot to ask your family to take on as a time of crisis. So I would certainly always recommend somebody to get someone who can help them navigate that system and make sure they're getting what they're entitled to.
I guess one of the ways we know that brain injuries are out there is by seeing the number of ads for lawyers in the personal injury field. It's like there's one on every bus. But I mean, and just to reiterate, these lawyers are not going after the person, the driver. They're going after the insurance company to pay out what's due, really. And sadly, that what's due has been cut. Is it enough still in the catastrophic?
It's new waters. So it's really the benefits were split in half. So prior to the changes, someone like Celia would have gotten $1 million for med rehab. So that includes your therapy, any medical equipment you might need, if there's home modifications required, etc. And then you would have another $1 million for attendant care. And I appreciate that $1 million sounds like a lot of money. But if you're someone who's young and has to go through a lifelong of therapy and who might need supportive housing or who might need a living caregiver, it's not that much money. And so since the changes, if you don't top up your personal insurance benefits, you're left with $1 million for both, which means there's some people are going to be making the choice. Do they have the personal support worker to help them through their daily routine, or do they have an OT who can teach them how to relearn the skills themselves?
Yeah.
So
Occupational
it's quite a choice.
therapist.
Yes.
It's not always about the fact that there's not coverage there. Now it's been decreased and there isn't as much coverage. But there are some situations where there are some great insurers, and this is not a blanket statement in any way, but there are some situations or many situations where the individuals are not able to access what is there because the insurers aren't recognizing their injury, because the person who has the injury can't organize themselves around to ask for it, can't make the demands. There's a certain obligation there when you are paying into your insurance each month that you will be returned to a state of function that you were before an injury. And that sometimes sadly isn't happening. They're not responsive. The insurers just aren't stepping up. They're not understanding the injury because it's not being explained by rehabilitation professionals who can voice that really well. And that's sometimes what your lawyers help you to navigate and get those individuals that can help that case be made.
And as also someone in the early days, if I didn't have the support around me, I could see how easily I would have given up on trying to get services that I may have even been entitled to. So you really do need to have a voice. It becomes very fatiguing physically and mentally to try and deal with the different layers of that. And it's a good way to, for people also to get involved in Toronto with an organization like the Brain Injury Society of Toronto. If it wasn't for them a couple of years ago, I don't think I would be out speaking about brain injury, because there's always that fear of, being labeled. And the more I got involved, at that time we had an executive director there by the name of Michelle, and she really opened up the world to me and said, come and be a little bit more involved. And I started writing for their blog, and eventually, I got comfortable speaking about what I went through. And I think that's the key, is getting people to speak about what they went through. I'm just one little person. There's a lot of people that have celebrity status out there that I've heard, they've encountered or had a mild concussion, brain injury really is what they had. And if they could come out and speak, because they're doing very well for themselves now, and they've learned how to manage this, bump in the road, sort of, to speak. So
it can be an injury that you get over like any other injury.
Yeah, I don't think that you, like most things, you don't get over 100%. Life is going to be different. It's learning, it's accepting what's happened to you and knowing that now you have a choice to make. And that choice is, do you let that just really demise your way of living, or do you say, to heck with that and a couple other colorful words, I'm sure, and you move forward in the best way that you can. I don't look at myself now as having even the physical disabilities. These are my new abilities. That's really what they are. And an organization like BIST really helps people. It gives you a place to go. It gives you community. And that becomes really important, because if you don't get out of your house, you get on that circle that Colleen spoke about earlier, where, you're feeling down, then you get depressed, so you don't go out. You don't go out, you get more depressed. And before you know it, you're like really down there. So I know that Melissa can speak to some of the community programs and stuff that's available. And also there's peer mentor programs that BIST has. They also have a lot of care providers, so family members that are struggling, maybe understanding. Know that your loved one is not lazy. They're not lying. They're really just, if they're tired, they're really tired.
Because those symptoms, the symptoms you described could very easily be misread and miscue folk to thinking that, it's something else going on entirely.
People often, they'll see somebody at a grocery store and said, oh, well, you can go get groceries, you can do this, there's nothing wrong with you. Yes, but you don't go home with that person and see that now they're laid up for maybe the next 24 hours. Some people could be 48 hours or a week. It depends. It's really variable. But I can tell you, for every fun activity that I enjoy in my life, because I've chosen to live life to the fullest again. And there are the times that I have to go home and just sleep or just do nothing. But that's okay, because I know that I'm saving up and building up my energy for the next great thing.
And to get back to you, Dr. Colantonio, in terms of the research you've done, one of the interesting things, since this is a feminist radio show, is your research with women and the fact that women in some homeless shelters are there because of brain injuries in part, and domestic partner violence, which we haven't talked about, but yet it's been very much in the news lately. Yes. So this can also be a cause of brain injury. Yes,
it's amazing how much focus there's been on professional sports, for instance, and that given how common it is, and that up to 92% of the hits are to the head, that we estimate that is probably very high prevalence, or there have been studies showing pretty high prevalence of brain injury in this population. And at the same time, there's historically a limited awareness among frontline workers, even the women themselves, about this. In September, we received some funding to do what we believe to be the first national, maybe international workshop bringing the world of brain injury and battered women together. And it was clearly an aha moment for a lot of the women working in the shelters there. They kind of knew something. They would express, they knew something was maybe not quite right, but they couldn't put their finger on it. And then having the education and the information about brain injury really allowed them to put two and two together. So I know we've are going to be doing more things nationally on this front in terms of providing some resources. But it's been a huge neglected area. So I'm also glad to hear that some things are happening at the local level as well.
This again comes under the educational, which is perfect for Brain Awareness, Injury Awareness Month, because that's the import of calling it that and doing something about it. So police educated, lawyers, family members, shelter workers, and tell us about those programs that, again, at the Brain Institute, Brain Injury Institute of Toronto, BIST. Tell us about the programs you're offering now, Melissa.
Right. Thank you. So, like I mentioned, we have weekly programming. So we try to do everything on a Tuesday. We do a lot of programs on Tuesday. And it's a whole gamut of programming that we offer. So we offer community outings, and that can be anything for a lot of people have trouble reading a whole book. So we have a movie club. So they'll go to a movie and then they'll sit outside and chat about that movie. Obviously, our staff who goes are aware that for some people, some of the activities might be overstimulating. So we're always very conscious of where the quiet spots are. So if we're going to to, let's say, the ROM, or we're going, I'm trying to think of anywhere else in the community we might go, but a movie
Ripley's.
theater or Ripley's Aquarium, that we know where to direct people if they start to get kind of overstimulated. So we do that. All our programming, I should mention, is free. Membership is $5 to a survivor with a brain injury. And then for family members, it's $40. And that gives them access to all our programs and services. So it's pretty affordable. And we offer quarterly workshops as well. And like Celia mentioned, we do a lot of workshops for caregivers and geared towards caregivers. So how to communicate with somebody once they've had a brain injury. How to allow for them to breaks. We have survivors speak with them.
And are doctors aware of you? Are lawyers aware of you? Are you getting referrals? Where do you get your referrals
We're trying
from?
to get our word out there as much as we can. So we've actually been doing a lot. We're sending our flyers more and more to more physiatrists' offices, psychologists' offices. So we're trying to get our words out there. We are well known in the amongst personal injury lawyers. But we are also known at a lot of the trauma units. So St. Mike's Head Injury Clinic, Sunnybrook, they'll refer folks to us after they're being discharged from the hospital to get in touch with us.
It's amazing programming. And what about the ongoing kind of personal rehabilitation that Celia had? Do you also make referrals for all those workers?
So there is one agency, the ABI Network. So we help people if they're struggling. Again, that's paperwork to be done. So we help them figure out what the application process looks like. And then those will go into the ABI Network, which is a centralized intake service. And from there, they will figure out what best ministry-funded program they can go to, because obviously we can't offer that resource, but we can help them get connected to those resources.
Now, when you said ABI, I immediately thought autism, of course, with
acquired brain
IBI.
injury,
Yeah. But I
yes.
mean, and they just got more money. Are you looking at potentially getting any more money out of the government, Ministry of Health?
We would love to have more money. I know there's lots of great brain injury organizations. We're, obviously the not-for-profit one, but there is the Community Head Injury Resource Services who are funded by the Ministry of Health, and I know, they're always putting in applications for more funding. We're in the midst of putting together a proposal for Trillium for funding that way. So the brain injury community is always looking to access more resources. Obviously, there's so many being underserved or not served right now. But I think the piece is, one, the funding, and two, the awareness, so that more doctors do know that we're there, more family physicians, more psychologists, more physiotherapists just know that we're there, because I'm sure they're seeing people who are struggling in their clinics and they're not sure where to go. So
I think it's just so important. The Education Month is so important in learning about, I think about people in the criminal justice system, and I've heard this theory, and I can see it, is a lot of our young teens or anyone really, women, men who go into the system, maybe they're under some sort of mild misdemeanor, but due to their behavior working within the system, they end up further down the line because police officers don't know how to speak to them, or the people within the criminal system aren't aware of that attitude that they're hearing back, or that way that person's interacting back with them, and then they're getting into deeper crime, and it's just until they're into places of of solitary confinement, and those issues start coming up, right? So I think if we could interrupt that process through education, teach more people how to manage the brain injury, teach individuals how to work with someone with a brain injury, maybe we can slow down that process. Like you were saying, Cheri, we need resources now to rather than pay later for very, very expensive.
And I can only
costs.
imagine. I mean, we're broadcasting from downtown Toronto, that the farther away you get from here into the rural areas, into northern Ontario, the less those services are available. Is that correct?
That's absolutely correct. And one of the things that we offer, and this is in conjunction again with the Ontario Brain Injury Association, is the peer support program that Celia mentioned a while ago. And I think it's a really great resource for people, because what it is you can connect with someone anywhere in the province, because it's by phone. So you contact us, or you contact the Ontario Brain Injury Association, and you speak about who you are and what you're experiencing. So it's open for caregivers, so spouses, mothers, fathers, sisters, brothers, and then people with a brain injury. And then they're matched with a peer mentor somewhere across the province. So they're looking to speak to someone who's undergone the same situation they are, and it's a 1 hour once a week phone call with that person where they can just talk about anything. They can vent about what's happening. They can say, how did you get through this? And they can just chat about their experiences. So it really helps to reduce isolation and to normalize what's going on in their world.
So Celia, you have actually lived experience of having a brain injury. So I'm going to let the last few words be yours. So what's ahead for you? Are you still going through rehab?
I've finished most of my formal rehab. I now do, I take a lot of what I learned, and I'm taking Pilates, I take ballet classes. It's really important to exercise your mind, to exercise your body, and to get out and be part of the community. And don't be afraid. Brain injury is not the end of the world. It's just a different chapter in your life.
Well, thank you. And Doctor, any studies upcoming that we should be aware of? Any research that...
Well, we did publish a special issue, first of its kind, called Sex, Gender, and Traumatic Brain Injury last February in the Archives of Physical Medicine and Rehabilitation, and it's freely available online. That could be a resource to everyone.
So if you think you might have a brain injury out there, and there probably is somebody listening who does and hasn't been diagnosed, and of course also if you work in the fields we've been discussing, hopefully this program has helped you a little bit. I want to say thank you to all my panelists. They've been phenomenal. And also thank you out there in Radio Land. You can, of course, contact us, and thank you for your tweets through Facebook, same name, Cheri Dinovo, or on Twitter, same name. And I want to thank our tech today, Lisa, and producer of the show, Lisa Truchak, who always comes through for us. Until next time, I have to say next week will be our last show before the summer break. So do tune in. Talk to you again on Three Women.
CIUT 89.5 FM, the station that brings you a sonic journey on Across the Universe with Ken